Good afternoon. I'm Tracy Fessenden, Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to today's conversation, Religion, Violence, and Digital Culture, Understanding QAnon. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to our panelists. I especially want to thank Sarah Riccardi-Schwartz, who is in Texas without electricity and heat. She will do her best to join us, but given that everyone in the Houston area is trying to use their cell phones, we may not have the luck we hoped for. But I did want to give her a shout out for helping us to think about this panel. Before we get started, a couple of quick items. If you would like to participate in the audience Q&A portion of today's event, you can submit questions throughout the event. On Zoom, please use the Q&A function. And on YouTube, use the chat box to the right of the video, and we will get to as many questions as we can. You might also want to keep a lookout for an upcoming event in March. The event is titled Opening a Star Gate to the Dark Gods, Psychic Espionage, Satanic Cults, and Occult Nazis on the Dark Web. That's a talk and a conversation on March 23rd with the center's guest, Jason Storm. He's chair and professor of religion and chair of science and technology studies at Williams College. As always, more information about all our events and research can be found on our website, csrc.asu.edu. You can also sign up for our mailing list for updates on all our news and events, or follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Our moderator today is our colleague, Jason Bruner. Jason is an associate professor of global Christianity in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies at Arizona State University. He is also a photographer and has published works of photography and creative nonfiction, in addition to his distinguished scholarly writing. His most recent scholarly monograph is Imagining Persecution: Why American Christians Believe There Is a Global War Against Their Faith. This is a genealogy of American Christian discourses of violence that gives particular attention to the ways that religious persecution has come to frame American perceptions of Christianity worldwide. And we'll be spending some time with that book at the center later in the spring, so stay tuned. And now I'll hand the mic over to Jason Bruner, who will introduce our panel.
Thank you very much, Tracy, and thank you to our panelists and to all of you who are joining us in Arizona and across the country. I want to begin with a brief introduction of the panel, and then I'll proceed to introduce the panelists themselves. And we'll have about 40 to 45 minutes of a sort of wide-ranging conversation, and then we'll open it up for your questions and comments. For many Americans after January 6th, Jake and Jelly became the face of QAnon. The image of him standing on the Senate dais, shirtless, flexing his biceps triumphantly as his painted face grinned under his horned fur helmet, is an indelible one that captured the surreal horror of that day, but also the strange digital world that he represented as the so-called Q shaman. But far from only attracting militant 30-something men, Q has also drawn in those like Lori Schock, a retired factory worker from Ohio, who confessed last year, "I feel God led me to Q. I really feel like God pushed me in this direction. I feel like if it was deceitful in my spirit, God would be telling me enough's enough. But I don't feel that. I pray about it. I've said, Father, should I be wasting my time on this? And I don't feel that feeling of I should stop." And then there are young Instagram lifestyle influencers who've taken Q's ideas of child trafficking and the global cabal and filtered them in soft light, trimmed them with rose and gold borders, insisting that to ignore their voice is to gaslight women. What are we to make of such a movement? The descriptions about what Q is have been as wide-ranging as the three quick examples I just gave. It's been termed a live-action role-playing game, a multi-level marketing scheme, a Gnostic sect, a domestic terrorism threat, an offshoot of American evangelicalism, and even a new religion. One reporter said that QAnon is what you might get if you asked L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, to write a Tom Clancy novel. More poetically, but also more ominously, Alana Strauss has described QAnon as a mist quietly settling over society, and people often don't realize they're breathing it in. Here to help us think through that issue of what we might collectively be breathing in, and more difficultly, but more importantly, what we might do about it, is an accomplished panel of scholars and experts. Adam Dara currently serves as Director of Intelligence at Vigilante, a cybersecurity firm. Before moving to private industry, Adam spent 8 years working for the US government, coordinating across federal agencies to fill critical knowledge gaps on national security priorities, where he developed a specialization in Central Eurasian political, security, and intelligence issues. Jamie Edmonds is a doctoral candidate in ASU's School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. With a focus on Southeast Asia, his research addresses questions of ethical formation in Western, Indonesian, and Islamic understandings of religion. He's also studied extremist and counter-extremist movements and currently works as a cybersecurity analyst at Vigilante, focusing on threat research and data. Candace Rondeau is a professor of practice and senior fellow with the Center on the Future of War, a joint initiative of ASU and New America. With an extensive background in documenting and analyzing political violence, she founded Resolve, a research network focused on finding solutions to violent extremism based at the United States Institute of Peace. She also writes a weekly column for World Politics Review. Thank you all for joining us. Candace, I'd like to start with you. How would you define QAnon, and how distinct is it from other networks, ideologies, and online communities today?
Well, thanks, Jason. Thanks for inviting me to this fascinating panel. It's, first of all, to be alongside Adam and James and yourself is fabulous. It's also very timely. As you know, here in Washington, we just closed the impeachment trial pertaining to January 6 events. But there's still work ongoing here in Congress in terms of trying to understand the different motivations of those who showed up on January 6th and folks like Jake and Jelly, and trying to put that into context in terms of preventing future events. So I think it's a great event, and I'm really excited. QAnon is lots of things to different people, as you pointed out. The FBI, of course, has last year termed it a domestic terrorist threat, yet not an organization, right? It seems to be a social movement. It's a digital social movement of some sort. But the origin story, I think, is the one that is probably the most important to focus on. It combines a few different elements of Web 2.0 in its kind of later phase of life. So moving from image boards, message boards online, into more networked, visually networked communications. And it started really, some might suggest somewhere around 2015, you started to see things like FBI Anon, CIA Anon, as part of the conversation on 4chan, which is an image board, message board, that was very popular with the far right. Over time, it evolved, and the real world heard of it, of course, was the case of Pizzagate and the shooting, or the near shooting, at Comet Ping Pong Pizza here, just a few miles from my house. But that's really only kind of the surface story. There are some intimations that the origin story is not just about the message boards. It also resides in this idea of using secret knowledge to inculcate members of the I am theosophy branch of, I guess you would say, a branch of Christianity or purported Christianity that emerged in the 1930s out of Chicago. That I am movement, of course, has lots of tentacles. I'm sure other folks here are going to unpack that a little bit. But you see, breadcrumbs and evidence of that movement, this great white brotherhood, as a thread throughout the QAnon enterprise, and it has evolved over time. Some have a theory that sometime around 2018, a man by the name of Thomas Schoenberger, who is a kind of polymath, who is also an adherent of this particular branch of theosophy, actually game-jacked the QAnon live action role-playing game and created an entire mythos. Interestingly, this all seemed to coincide with the same time when you saw a number of intelligence, ex-intelligence officers, from the NSA, from the CIA, including most famously Bill Binney from the NSA, Michael Flynn, who was of course Trump's national security advisor, began playing around with the idea that they somehow had the secret knowledge that QAnon was dispensing. And today, some of you might have seen on Twitter, a colleague of mine, Dave Troy, listed out, roughly 30 odd former and current intelligence and army military folks who affiliate themselves with QAnon openly. So some of that live action role-playing adaptation that occurred sometime around 2017, 2018 appears to have inculcated quite a lot of members of the military, which is very striking, I think. And I'll leave it to the others to talk about some of the other elements.
Yeah, maybe Adam, to you, thinking about sort of what happens when this movement is leaving a network like 4chan and moving on to other networks like YouTube, Twitter, and so on. Help us think through what that means for what the movement and what its ideas have become, and maybe even suggesting, does this kind of trajectory give us any indication of how it might develop from here?
Yeah, this is fascinating. One of the last projects I worked on in the government before I came out was specifically mis and disinformation campaigns emanating from the Russian Federation. And there was talk at the time. I left in 2018, but in 2015 and 2016, we began exploring the idea of what these very sophisticated, let's call them like well-informed, intellectually tantalizing, like fringe ideas that were being, shared and promulgated extensively with regard to a potential mis and disinformation campaign coming from the Russian Federation. So my optic is based on like, does it like this, what does it smell like? What does it seem like? I mean, it's because it's achieving aims that, that coincide nicely with the goals of any sophisticated intelligence operation from my optic. I just want to be clear with that. But again, like that was my job. So that's, that's something that I was, immersed in at the time. And since then it's obviously taken off in a very different trajectory. And it's gaining international like followings since then. And I think it's universally appealing to a government skeptical audience. You combine that with the cynicism on pick your source of information for news or entertainment. Cynicism is high where, some people are by choice or by force or by whatever regulations in where they live, they're locked down. Either they've locked themselves down or, they are legitimately locked down. And so you have a very fertile ground of large swaths of the population that are already skeptical, they're cynical, and there's this very natural tendency to distrust, the governing elite, no matter where you are on any spectrum of any kind, And so when you have this population now that they're home all the time, they're on the internet, they're there, you have these other more legitimizing platforms that are more mainstream, like you said, YouTube, Facebook, and all the grams and the books and the comms and the, you have you combine that with a fertile, cynical population around the world. It'll be interesting to see where it goes. But, this, in my opinion, because of how divisive this ideology is, they take stuff that's like 80% true that is universally appealing, right? You can't say you're against human trafficking, right? It's like, yeah, human trafficking, that's awful. right? That's bad. Yes, bad. And then that other 20% is just so tantalizing and fringe and sexy, and that's, that's the hallmark of a very sophisticated intelligence operation, in my opinion, to just sow discord and discontent, and to drive wedges within communities, within faiths, within the political spectrum. And, I'm anxious to hear and to explore other ways of thinking about this issue, because it is very apropos. It's here to stay, and so how do you, it's here, what next? So that's just from where I sit.
Hey Adam, can I follow up on a couple of things? I want to ask a question. You mentioned 2017, 2018. Some of the ideas that you're seeing pop up in the QAnon networks, sites like 4chan and its successors, 8chan, 8kun. You said that there's in your role in analyzing some of that intelligence, it seemed to be derived from Eastern Europe or Russian campaigns. Was I hearing that correct?
Yeah. Again, like, we're talking like Pizzagate time from when I was there, right? You had these segments within the elite of the United States political establishment as well, sharing these ideas from that would make, at the time, Secretary Clinton look like she was somehow at the head of this, baby eating cabal of elites, right? And so at the time, we were looking at Russian interference in our election. That was a thread we just began to pull on, like, wait a minute, where's this coming from? Like, what kind of information is this? And, its goals at the time were very much in line with Russia's goals in our election, which is just divide, keep us at each other's throats, and disrupt. And so that's what I meant. We just started pulling on that thread, and I left before there was any conclusive.
Okay. Yeah, to follow up, maybe back to Candace, within the United States, we'll think about the international context of this again later on, but within the United States, you mentioned in your initial response a number of kind of possible inroads into these kinds of ideas and networks. Some of these could be sort of religious or theological, some of them could be moral or political. And bringing in different kinds of figures, religious figures, and including, you mentioned a number of people who are from the military and national security. So could you just sort of elaborate a bit more on that? Like, to whom have these ideas appealed, and why do you think they've appealed to those people?
Well, it's a good question. I want to also comment a little bit on the Russian origins, or at least the Russian tie. I think one of the challenges that we have with Russian disinformation is trying to understand what's opportunistic, what parts of the Russian population itself are also captive to similar ideas, and what's being expressed. I think what Adam is getting at is, there is this idea of the third positionist movement within Russia, promoted by a number of different philosophers. One, a couple of famous ones who are very close to Putin. That I think it's worth noting that this idea of civilizational conflict between European-oriented and origin nations, including Russia, including the United States in theory, including parts of Europe, and non-Christian states, whether they're Arab or otherwise, is essentially a fundamental clash that is predestined, simply because of the inherent good and nature of Western civilization and sort of Christian civilization. So that civilizational conflict idea is something that you hear. It's an age-old trope of white supremacy, for sure, and it is something that has kind of evolved over time, throughout history. So the biggest strand is around that civilizational clash. And I think the reason why we see so much kind of convergence of worlds, of the intelligence world, the military, it's not coincidental that the United States has ended two major conflicts, more or less ended them, right? Iraq, Afghanistan. We're winding down our presence in the Middle East, and this is a time when you can look at the United States in two different frames. One is everything is fine, the republic is safe and sound, or the republic is in decline. And the first sign of that decline is the lack of total victory in the Middle East. And I think that's where those strains start to converge, right? Where this kind of really deep antipathy toward the Muslim world kind of then starts to spill into these other threads of the Great White Brotherhood, special secret knowledge. The I Am movement really has echoes in QAnon. The I Am movement of the 1930s, this sort of theosophist branch, essentially had this idea that one of its movement founders was George Washington reincarnated. And if you see, if you follow Mike Flynn and his Parler account, his Twitter account, here, after he took the QAnon oath, there's a person who kind of replicates the same idea, quotes George Washington a lot, really likes this idea of kind of predestined greatness. So I think, the appeal is trying to revive something that seems to have been tarnished, right? And there's this kind of great lost cause driver and motivation that I think brings people to the trough, but then it's the secret knowledge, the mystery of secret symbols, cues that come from Donald Trump during the press conference, or some other major influencer. That is what keeps people strung along. And I think Adam's point about the fact that people are home now and are essentially a captive audience. This is why the fever hasn't broken. People were expecting it to break after the impeachment or after January 6th, but the fever hasn't broken because the fever is still going, right? We're still in the middle of this pandemic, and there's a lot of suspicion, a lot of very obvious government failure. So kind of a self-licking ice cream cone, as it were.
Yeah, I'd like to bring Jamie into the conversation now. Jamie, in addition to some of the large scale ideas that Adam and Candace have been talking about in terms of placing this politically within United States history, placing this kind of more immediately within the pandemic of the last year, I wonder if we could also think about not just kind of these kind of large geopolitical ideas, but these other ways that people are drawn into this. And I'm thinking about memes on the internet, the visual culture around some of these ideas, some of these movements, the short documentary style videos that are pretty common. They have a pretty visceral effect when you watch these. They're very engrossing. They tend to be very dramatic, very high paced. Can you help us think about sort of not just the appeal or the allure or the need for like these kind of large ideas, but also sort of how the internet shapes the style and presentation of what might be appealing to people and drawing them in?
Sure, thanks, Jason. Just one of the things that I've been doing while we're sitting here is tracking how many Telegram posts are happening as we're in this presentation on these QAnon groups and other associated groups. We are up to 55. So 55 posts since we began. Of those posts, there were 3 new videos. And so part of the appeal or part of what's going on here is that there's so much information, right? So let's say you don't necessarily or don't have a huge appeal to the sort of Christian I am sort of physiology, that's not a word, visual sort of ecosystem. Then you have things, I actually pulled something this before, I just wanted to see what was going on. I think this is a big part of how people become a part of these communities. And this is pulled from a Telegram group of a rather, a very, I don't want to say, I'll just say it's from a Telegram group that associates with QAnon. So here's a bit of it. It says, life has absolutely come at me and my family, and for lack of a better phrase, it beats us to a bloody expletive pulp for a little bit. Needless to say, expletive nearly broke me. Expletive nearly broke us. I say expletive near because on Wednesday, something beautiful happened. God blanketed my family with a miracle which has until now left me speechless. My friend, redacted, took it upon himself to arrange an impromptu fundraiser for me and my family. IET and We the Media. We the Media is a organization I can explain later that sort of propagates ideas and news articles around a lot of QAnon things, as well as regular news, hopped on board with no hesitation at all. To them, I say thank you from the bottom of my heart and soul. I love you guys and gals. Within a couple of hours, enough money had been donated to me that I was able to give my folks more than enough money to cover rent, medications for my mom, and groceries for the couple of months. My parents were in tears, and that isn't hyperbole or exaggeration. The relief I saw in my parents is the relief I haven't seen from them since before we lost everything in the fire that was in August 2019. All they could do was sit and cry the blessing we as a family were receiving. And so even if, for example, there are people who are part of these communities, even if they don't identify it or not, when stories like this, and there's tons of stories like this are posted, there are people who say, well, this group is doing good for this family who had their house burned down. We're able to support them. There's videos there's an Arizona-based group, and there's videos of them actually raising money and getting a homeless man an apartment. I don't know if it's real or not, but that is, they have videos, etc. And so it seems like they're doing a lot of good in the community when they see on a sort of broader scale that we're talking about their politicians being pedophiles and their sort of government being terrible, and they see some of these communities such as QAnon as doing good, and is doing good from a Christian perspective, right? So I think that a lot of these some of this appeal has to do with the sharing of very close personal stories and good news. That isn't to say that as we say, the fever is still going. I don't know if COVID was over, if this would be going away. I think that from what I am seeing going on in these underground sort of cultures, it's ramping up in many ways. And in fact, as you sort of indicated to Adam, many QAnon supporters moved off of different platforms. They've now gone to places like Telegram. Now what we're seeing is that it's called B communication, I think. It's another system of communication that can be encrypted and supposedly sent through radio signals, right? There's even sort of jokes now that these communities are going to use carrier pigeons like they did in the Middle East, like extremist groups did in the Middle East to communicate. And so all that's a joke. All of this plays into this idea that QAnon, that Christian ideology is under attack, and these people are doing good for the world. Look, they're helping the homeless, their families are being fed, etc. So I think that at the sort of raw base of some of these communities is what's happening.
Yeah. So Jamie, if I can follow up here, I think in a number of articles on QAnon, especially those that sort of tend towards focusing on its role in drawing in evangelical Christians in the United States, for example, right? It's priming sort of that they often prime the beliefs, you could say, of what does QAnon believe? And so I'm going to ask you to put on your religious studies sort of theorist hat, if you would, and think about this kind of preoccupation with what kinds of weird things do all of these people supposedly believe, is that missing the mark, or sort of should the analysis maybe shift towards like the formation of community, or these other kinds of things that you just talked about, in thinking about how social media affirms one another, how they sort of form these, use these same networks to raise funds for one another. I remember several of the people who are running for office who had affiliated with QAnon, will often say things like, well, it's interested in, they just want to bring us together. Those kinds of things are. So could you help us think through sort of the preoccupation with the supposedly strange things that they believe, with sort of these other dimensions of what also seems to be motivating these networks and communities?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jason. So I think a couple of things. I would never say that there is not a sort of a rooted ideology and sort of, I don't know, resonance with certain Christian ideas, certain histories in the United States. I wouldn't make that claim. However, I think the beliefs, as you indicated in the intro, can be very ranging, right? We can talk about lizard people, we can talk about the vaccine, sort of the COVID vaccine, implanting microchips, or we can just simply talk about, the ruining of democracy. And so it takes a lot of different forms. But as we talk about in religious studies, one of the things, we have a couple different options, right? We can either choose to say, well, these people identify as QAnon, it's a new religion, whatever they believe is whatever they believe, right? And we can just accept whatever they believe as a part of this phenomenon. We could also sort of look to the authorities of QAnon that we see in the media and say, well, how does an individual's sort of beliefs match with this authority figure, and sort of come up with some sort of definition of QAnon? Is it domestic terrorism? Is it what is it? I think that after kind of talking through a little bit with Adam, one of the things that's interesting is that on, let's say, Telegram or Parler, one of the things that you can do is you can post a lot of different things, and then see how people are responding, right? And so in some ways, yeah, maybe there are some core beliefs of QAnon, but I think what's happening is that there's just a lot of information that is thrown to the wall, and they see, and whoever is sort of a part of that group or community is seeing what sticks and goes with that, right? The other day, I went down a rabbit hole about like the lost land of Atlantis, right? I was like, going back to your secret knowledge, Candace, and I was like, I'm a very rational human being, but I was over here like, oh man, maybe it's real. You know what I mean? Because I was like reading all of this stuff about Atlantis, right? And so that's just to say that, like, I think looking at this too closely to sort of understand a religion as either anything that anybody in these groups says or anything that these authorities say kind of misses the point. And that we really have to approach this, of course, with a religious studies approach, but also an anthropological approach, which is looking at the way in which these communities forms, right? And the way in which these societies forms. We're looking at economies growing. We're looking at different forms of economy here. We're looking at different symbols emerging that are both new and have reference to the KKK. Or from other white nationalist symbology. And so I think we have to be very careful to not say, well, this is just an offshoot of some branch of Christianity. I don't mean to dismiss that. I think we just, as religious studies scholars, need to be very careful when thinking about this group, because I don't believe that we should use belief as one of the really crucial methods for analyzing this group, because in some ways the beliefs could be whatever sticks to the wall that's being sort of tossed at constantly.
So even given that, though, I mean, there are some, I mean, there's a recent survey by the American Enterprise Institute that was conducted just a couple weeks ago, or at least the results were released a couple weeks ago. That said 27% of white evangelicals, the most of any religious group, believe the QAnon conspiracy theory to be completely or mostly accurate. So just to give some comparative figures, that's 27% of white evangelicals compared to 18% of white Catholics, compared to 15% of white mainline Protestants, all the way down to 7% of Black Protestants, which is the lowest figure. So how are we to think about, I mean, I understand the problem with sort of fixating on what are the things that QAnon believes or teaches or something, and sort of how does that help us think about them in one way or another, but you nevertheless have these kinds of affinities. So what do you think accounts for the affinity of white evangelicals to a movement like QAnon?
Well, I mean, I think that QAnon has a lot of first of all, QAnon is oftentimes will post, as you reference, meme culture. They'll post pictures of Pepe the Frog, all frog lives matter, and they'll post Bible verses over it, right? I think that certainly appeals to I think racism. I mean, I think that's a very clear appeal to white evangelicals. Not saying that all white evangelicals are somehow racist, but it is difficult to say the white race is completely superior if you're not white. And many of these groups do have a piece of that associated with them, which makes it very difficult, right? Because some may say, no, QAnon is not a all white movement, and yet you still have, groups that are KKK groups that will be cross-posted in these groups, right? You still have guerrilla warfare groups who are cross-posting in these, right? And so I think what are we to do with these affinities? Well, we finally can say racism is very real and alive in America. I think that certainly that makes sense. I think that the constant Bible verses, and as we talked about in reference to your book, there is this idea of martyrdom. This idea of digital soldiers fighting for the Christian cause on the internet, which appeals to a very particular population in the United States in particular. I think that is a huge piece of this as well. But yeah, I think I sort of addressed your question.
Candace or Adam, do you want to jump in here on that question?
I'd like to jump in on the digital soldiers. It's now a trigger word for me because some colleagues and I have been doing a little bit of research on Parler and trying to kind of understand what happened there. Many of you know that there's an Austrian computer scientist who has taken publicly available information and then sort of live leaked it, essentially, live archived it from Parler. And we've been looking at that for a while now. And obviously this theme of digital soldiers, digital army comes through on a number of big influencers. One who we're looking at in particular is Michael Flynn. And I have to say, it's not contained on these platforms. I think that the important thing to understand is that it's not a Parler phenomenon. It's not a Telegram phenomenon. I think what we're now seeing evolve is this, again, convergence of a phenomenon where, progressive temporary banning or moderation on Twitter and Facebook migrates people to platforms like Parler and then Telegram, and this kind of victimhood narrative that is a strain in QAnon, which is to say, global elites have done things to destroy the proper order, right? And that must be why the proper order has victimized me. Right? That is, I think, one of the big sticky pieces of the QAnon narrative. So that has merged with then big tech, another global elite set of institutions has unleashed its wrath on free speech, on liberty, and on Christianity, apparently. And they don't want Christians. And so over to Parler, over to Telegram, over to Gab. However, I think this is the part that I think many people are not yet aware of. I think Adam probably will be in time if he's looking at this, and others who are looking at the digital piece, it is very clear that standalone websites that are basically data harvesting websites that imitate a Facebook-like front, but bear all the markings of the Great Awakening, the storm is coming, digital soldiers marching. That stuff is now becoming a catchment for those parlor platforms and other platforms that are just being de-hosted, right, altogether. And that's what we have to be really, I think, aware of. That's where the digital trend is going. And that is scary for a lot of different reasons, not the least of which is because outside external state actors, particularly Russia, have a great deal invested in capturing that data.
Yeah, so thank you, Candace. I want to pivot to Adam, which you already sort of did at the end of your comments there, and because I do want to pick up on the internationalization of these ideas, and it's not, obviously, I think both of you have spoken, it's not something like an American export, because the data and the networks are much more complicated than that. So Adam, help us think about what it means to think with QAnon internationally. Sort of what are some of the things that appeal beyond its Americanness? Because I think a lot of what tends to be covered in America media outlets are the Pizzagate type America curiosities around the movement, rather than some of these other issues like Candace was just speaking to. So can you help us think about what it means to think with QAnon internationally, and how these networks tend to function?
Absolutely, and I'm going to credit this to one of our Q&A posters, Jonathan McCoy, for reminding me about the example I'm about to share. So thank you, Jonathan. One way to think about this would be, for example, a handful of years ago, there was a motorcycle club in Russia called Night Wolves. And Night Wolves became a really interesting place that there was a nexus between, true Russian orthodoxy, true Russian patriotism, foreign policy, military, special operations, charitable outreach. Like, it just became this one-stop shop for, like, yeah, man, like Russia, and every time, like, I remember this infamous ride, it really was a fool's errand. They were riding to in commemoration of World War II, and World War II was a sacred cow. It really is a sacred cow, in especially in the former Soviet republics, who suffered greatly during World War II. So like these motorcycle gangs became this really interesting instrument used for, I'll just say, soft power, for lack of a better term. But it also became a rallying point for certain segments of the Russian population to get behind this legitimate organization behind Ukraine, because the Ukraine invasions actually segmented and fractured the Russian nationalists and the pan-Slavic nationalists. Because they're like, wait a minute, but Ukrainians are they're Slavs. Like, why are we attacking Slavic brothers? And so they had to quickly pivot, well, Night Wolves, you must support the state, because we're everything to the real Russians. And so I think from a global perspective, these movements that kind of that make, they become the epicenter of all these things that Jamie brought up, right? Yes, we do charitable work. We're soft power. We're the carriers of the real truth, and fill in the blank. Traditional Christianity has abandoned us. For example, I have lots of different types of weird friends, and I do have acquaintances and people that I would call friends that have bounced these QAnon ideas off of me. Adam, what do you think about this? You were on the inside, you're part of the deep state. Tell me, man. Tell me what's going on, man. Are these? And I'm like, look. I understand your heart. I understand you're skeptical. I understand. I totally get it. I understand why people get upset about when their party loses. I totally get it. Right? Nobody likes losing. Well, maybe some people, but so I think from a foreign promulgation, like these types of movements are a great tool to use as like holding up these like as the true standard bearer of like the true fill in the blank Georgians, the true Estonians, or whatever, right? The true Kenyans, whatever, because you can just kind of pick and choose what sticks to the wall, what resonates with the population that I'm most concerned about. Like, what part of the population do I need to win back? Get on their good side again, and so and again, like it's preying on all of our fundamental, human skepticisms, right? Like we get upset when we feel like we're being victimized by an elite. Like, again, fill in the blank. What does elite mean? I don't know. And so it's just like, it just takes advantage of these very natural things. And last weird thing I'll say in the next 35 seconds, but when Jamie brought up this idea of like what sticks to the wall, like, again, this another little checkbox that I mark and go, oh, intelligence operation, because during the height of the mis and disinformation campaigns coming from Russia, that's exactly what they would do. Exactly. They would like say something and they would measure posts, reposts, who shared it, how often it was shared. Bureaucrats were rewarded on like maximum impact for this share. And it could be about anything. So it's like, okay, what sticks to the wall? So I think everybody's bringing up very, very interesting points. And it's as it expands globally, it'll be interesting to see how certain less free governments use these sticky items to their own ends. Very interesting.
Yeah. On that note, Jamie, I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to sort of the conspiratorial religious thinking beyond Christianity, and how some of these kinds of ideas operate in digital or non-digital spaces. I'm thinking predominantly in Islamic contexts that you probably know best, but you could also speak to maybe similar elements within India, for example. So could you help us think, like, are some of these ideas from QAnon being picked up in Islamic contexts, or is the nature of some of these critiques similar, but they're taking them in a different direction because of a different kind of culture? Could you help us think through that?
Hey, thanks, man. You'd kind of prepped me for the question, and I kept sort of racking my brain about it. I think one of the interesting things, the way that I actually came, because I don't work on QAnon. Well, I do now, but I have not previously done a lot of work with QAnon. And really where this came up is in some other research in another part of the world, in which a post was shared called Operation Domestic Terrorism. And I was like, oh, this should be interesting. Let's take a look. And it was shared in a primarily Muslim community that was going to target all... sorry, I gotta be careful. It was going to target certain groups of people in the US associated with QAnon. So they were going to, hack into their home computers or try to take down their networks, or, for example, DonaldTrump.com was something they were going to attack in a particular way. And so one of the things that's actually been interesting to me is how certain Muslim communities have sort of taken advantage of this situation to attack American targets, even if, in the sort of mainstream media, and as we're talking about this, we have identified QAnon as sort of having very radical ideas. My job in sort of thinking about analyzing this is to figure out, well, we still want to protect Americans, right? We still want to protect the U.S. from foreign attacks. And so, thinking the other side of this, which is not just how do conspiracy theories move around in other communities, but how has this particular thing done the opposite in other types of communities? That is, how are attacks from other types of communities impacting QAnon groups, right? And you know, your grandmother who may, or your mother or your dad or grandfather, whoever who may be a part of this group, who now has all of their credit card information stolen because they are a part of this group. And so I think something that I've been also thinking about, and I know we were going to talk a little bit about policy, is that, for example, I don't want to sort of make huge generalizations, so I'll talk about Indonesia and what happened when there were riots fueled by Islamic hardliners there, who were supposedly being funded by ISIS, and the Indonesian government shut down social media. Now, one of the things, I've been there when they've done that, and it's kind of shocking at first. The Indonesians were like, yeah, man, just like turn on your VPN or don't go on the internet in a little while or for a few days, you know. But I was sort of shocked. And one of the things that does, though, is it makes everyone equal. No one has access, right? And so one of the things that I've been thinking about is like, how do we, from the other side, how do we deal with free speech? How do we protect people who might be under attack for their views in America, even if I don't agree with them, or even if they're conspiratorial? And as far as the way that conspiracies move in Indonesia that I've followed, is that videos are like the visual things are very compelling to people, right? So there was a time where Indonesians were sharing the burning of a mosque, right? That video was not authentic, but it got shared, and then a bunch of churches got attacked, and then this sort of continued, right? Lots of videos are shared, and so then the sharing gets shut down by the government. And so regardless of that very strong sort of, you know, response by the Indonesian government, it also, in this situation, makes me sort of think like, well, what were other responses that could have been made, or how do we deal with the public policy of this? Even if you don't understand QAnon, we still have to be able to come together as a community and interact in the US. And so how do we, what's our step forward, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. I'm going to pivot to maybe one or two questions on policy, and then I'd like to turn it to, to turn to some of the questions that have been coming in through the Q&A. Maybe just in a broad sense, this is to any of the three of you. In reading, especially since the January 6th attack at the Capitol, it seems, and I'm going to make a massive generalization, forgive me for this, but it seems as though, one, in the analyses of what QAnon is, especially in light of a violent event like that, they're kind of too deep, to what seemed to me deep-seated ideas that condition sort of how we might respond to it. And one is sort of thinking in terms of like, is QAnon the next iteration of the culture wars from, roughly the late 70s to the present? In thinking about gender and race and nationalism. And then another is the legacy of the war on terror. And so maybe as a final general question to any of the three of you, how do these frameworks sort of help us, or how do they inhibit us from thinking about how we might respond to this kind of movement? Because they are deeply ingrained both in our policy and in our kind of popular consciousness, for lack of a better word. Candace, perhaps can I turn to you first?
Yeah, I mean, I'm struck in this conversation.
I think you muted.
All right. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So I'm struck by this conversation and some others that I've had about QAnon and about kind of how to deal with right-wing extremism, especially online. 10 years ago, we were not having a conversation about protecting the free speech rights of anybody who adhered to Al-Qaeda's philosophy or ISIS philosophy. We never would have had that conversation. We would have had I think we had some very heated debates about civil liberties and the targeting of Muslim communities in this country, and in particular, Arab and South Asian communities. I think that was a debate that was being had, but it was pretty small by comparison. And I'm really struck by the fact that the adherents to this particular extremist movement happened to be part of the dominant class, happened to have set the stage for the global war on terrorism framework. And the conversation we're having now is, what about their free speech rights? That's dangerous for a number of reasons. One, it fails to examine the many flaws with the global war on terror and its framework, and the inheritance, as you just mentioned, which part of that inheritance is this idea that the United States is exceptional in its constitution, that its democratic principles are so ironclad that even in the forged in the fire of wars abroad and tested, the crucible of war abroad, neither that nor the crucible of our own dysfunction at home can destroy the exceptionalism of the American Republic. This is a very dangerous idea on a number of levels. And it is exactly how we have arrived at this moment, I think. From a policy perspective, there's some very practical questions to be asked about Section 230 in particular. I don't think we have any good answers on that yet, but certainly this idea that free speech protects behavior that might otherwise be seen as organized crime. In some cases, that's what you're dealing with QAnon. In the case of January 6th, you had hundreds of people who together moved together to take violent action against the state. And they coordinated their activities using digital means. They did so under the guise of some sort of message or signal from QAnon. There's no question that that is nothing short of domestic terrorism, and in fact is very much replicates the model that we've seen in Al-Qaeda and ISIS and so forth. So the challenge for us is to not apply a different standard, or to at least question the original standard that we were applying when it came to ISIS and Al-Qaeda, because clearly there's a challenge here, right? Secondly, people are making money doing this. Let's just be 100% clear. Money is changing hands for the for apps, for digital trails, for data information, for you name it. And when money changes hands online for organized criminal behavior, that is something that we should look at in terms of RICO statutes. That is something that we should look at in terms of understanding that there are some, including some of these influencers that we've mentioned here, who are absolutely taking advantage of their grounding in government, their sort of authority as members of the military, and using that for profit. That is a super dangerous situation. And so to think of this as a movement that has to be contained, because it has sort of these religious overtones, or it's sort of upsetting the apple cart. This is more than upsetting the apple cart. This is really portions of what's going on online verges on criminal organized crime behavior. And we have to treat it that way.
I'm gonna thank you, Candace. That ends my questions. I'm gonna turn to some of the ones that have come over the Q&A. If you have other questions that you would like to ask, I obviously can't guarantee that we will get to them, but we will. You can certainly type them into the Q&A chat function, and we will see what we have time for. So I'd like to start sort of where Candace ended, and this one comes from David Goodwin. Aren't the robust algorithms associated with the digital populations being targeted providing an extremely sophisticated feedback loop that's shaping the disinformation messages, making them more and more powerful manipulators? Where does that end? Candace or Adam, would you like to chime in on that?
My answer is going to be really short, and Candace will have a much more intelligent sounding answer than I will. But in short, yes, it's getting a lot scarier, and no, it's not going to end. Candace, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, this is the challenge that we have right now with the profit motive for social media tech. Okay, algorithms right now are built for feeding our outrage, and that is the loop that we are in. Feeding outrage is the game, and you can only feed outrage though if you can monitor every single movement of a population. And so this is not even about Section 230, frankly. Okay, so people want to focus on Section 230 and the challenge of liability, but this is really bigger than that.
Can you just quickly explain Section 230?
So Section 230 is a provision under the Federal Trade Commission administration, essentially calling for, well, essentially that gives liability protection to tech providers who facilitate online communication. So unlike a newspaper or a TV station that is subject to defamation and libel laws, anything that is produced online, I should say, platforms that produce things online or communicating technologies that communicate online are not responsible for what's posted on their platforms, right? They're not liable for the commentary offered by, Mary Smith or John Smith, essentially. So that protection is one that has been now, of course, hotly debated, and of course, Donald Trump himself had advocated for it to be struck altogether from the books. I don't think that's the answer. But I don't want to divert attention, because I do think the Section 230 debate is a bit of a diversion. We need more algorithmic transparency, and we need a heck of a lot less surveillance of populations for profit and greater privacy protections, because otherwise the algorithms can't function well if they don't have enough data to prey on.
Yeah, thank you. I'm trying to.
Jason, do you mind if I jump in real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I was just going to say, one of the interesting things, Candace, that you're saying surveillance for profit is that as you've already noted, lots of other websites, et cetera, that are like Facebook are springing up. The other thing that's happening is that there are other proxy services. There are other people are getting smart about how to use the internet, right? And so part of my thing is we all need to get smart about using the internet. We all need to get better at not allowing surveillance to take place. And there's lots of ways you can very simply do that. And so the more education we can do on that, obviously the better. And to your organized crime point, we're seeing more of these communities go to the dark web. That is by that, I mean using Tor browser and going to .onion sites. And so we see the underground is a will accept them, right? And they will continue to organize crime and make it even more difficult to track it. And so that was a very interesting point. That's all.
There are a number of really interesting questions. I'm going to try and group a couple of them. And here it's really unfortunate for those of you who may be joined us after the introduction. Sarah Riccardi-Schwartz was supposed to be a part of this panel, and her specialty is Christian nationalism and fundamentalism, among other sorts of topics. So some of these questions would have been right down her alley. Basically, I'm going to try and sort of summarize maybe a couple of these around sort of placing QAnon within history. I think it was last year that the Arizona Republic, I believe Rob Odell, wrote several quite good articles about QAnon and conspiracy theories in Arizona. And part of that work was looking at sort of programs that broadcast on kind of obscure radio channels, pamphlet networks, sort of self-published book tours that people would do, programs like Alex Jones that kind of grow out of tiny sort of radio shop operations into something that's quite massive. So that's one piece of it. If any of you would like to speak to sort of where does QAnon fit in that kind of genealogy, if you will. And another piece, which I think we've touched on at a few points, is to how to think about some of the ideas that are a part of these networks, the ones that seem to stick more frequently. Ideas about Christian nationalism, ideas about race, ideas about masculinity, femininity. How are we to think about QAnon kind of sort of historically with respect to either one or both of those sort of sets of concerns and ideas feeding into it? Do I have any takers? You're muted.
That's a lot of questions all packed into one.
I'm trying. There are a number of good ones in the chat. Sorry, I was trying to put too many together, perhaps.
No. Well, I mean, I think that's interesting, actually. In studying this one particular kind of digital soldiers, digital army thread that with my colleagues at ASU, I have been struck by how there's this. It seems to also prey on this kind of narrative of the American entrepreneur. There are quite a few folks who kind of see themselves as like, it kind of reminds me of Mary Kay Cosmetics, or these early 1980s pyramid scheme, sales kind of orientation and the ability to make a buck and to be sort of self-sufficient, right? This whole idea that you don't need people, but you do need people. I mean, this is kind of an old American idea that we've seen play out in all kinds of different evolutions of religious thinking in this country. So I think you hit on something there that's really important to know. It's just that, up by the bootstraps kind of idea that you could grab onto this, quasi-religious set of beliefs, create a community, and then potentially also become an entrepreneur, an influencer, somebody who's got cachet and can bring, kind of prosperity doctrine, bring prosperity to you through your belief and through your propagation.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's interesting. I mean, in thinking about it, sort of along the lines of Mary Kay, some of those kind of sort of multi-level marketing type pitches, right, are also based on sort of an idea that, like, they don't want you to know about this, but you can know about this here, and you can make a buck off of it. Which is quite, I think, fascinating. There's a question, maybe sort of, this is jumping off of a question that Eric Lederman has asked about the dark web, and part of his question is about could QAnon have taken hold pre-internet, or is it just an internet digital phenomenon? So that's one thing. Maybe related to that is there seems to be a tricky moment that Jamie alluded to a moment ago, which is, right, it sort of moves out of these pretty hard to use and fairly obscure parts of the internet into ones that are very public and very easy to use. And then for the most part, they get kicked off of those and are now back into ones that are sort of more difficult to publicly access, we'll say, or perhaps going into the dark web. So one would think that would make it more difficult for more people to access it if it's in less accessible places. So is this suggesting perhaps, what does this mean for what the movement might become if it's moving towards ever sort of less user-friendly type platforms, or at least less publicly visible ones?
Okay, I'm gonna, again, Jason, a lot to unpack. Excellent questions. These are really cool. Just a quick 30-second thing about, okay, so the dark web is a fascinating ecosystem. It's used by misfits, by highly hyper-educated individuals. It's a place for LGBTQ individuals in certain parts of the world where they're not allowed to, be. That's how they communicate. So like the dark web is a fascinating ecosystem for everything. And it's also a popular place. I know Jamie didn't say any wordy dirds during his thing, so I'll also honor that no cussing rule, but let's call them poo-poo posters. So these guys that just love shenanigans, right? Like Kekas, like the Kek boys, for example. They just, there's a thriving culture of just saying outlandish, ridiculous things for just because you can. And so there's a lot of that in the underground as well. And so, okay, this will connect, I promise. So Signal, okay, so the chat app Signal, during some protests, some of which turned to violence, some of which didn't, were figuring out that they needed to increase their user privacy settings over the last, I think it was even 4 or 5 months ago. They were seeing that law enforcement was using some of the stuff, some of the messages, the facial recognition anyway, and they're like, wait, we need to increase our user privacy settings. So they adopted new features like group chats and blurring faces and all these new things to help their users stay less visible, right? And so, but that can be used for everybody, right? So it was this weird side effect that's like, okay, great, we helped this group, increase their privacy acumen, right? And I have friends coming to me now, it's gonna connect, I promise. Hey, Adam, what's Signal? How do you use it? What's Telegram? Okay, so interesting little side thing. So Russians for many, many years used to consider they would use US-based email addresses because they were less concerned what American authorities were reading. They didn't care that we were reading their emails. So they stopped using .ru. And so what they felt like was okay for them to be read, they would use their .ru address. I find it incredibly fascinating that Telegram is becoming the preferred platform for US citizens who feel like, we don't care if the Russians know what we're talking about. We just don't want our government reading our stuff and being associated with these movements. And so there's a lot of maturity happening and privacy and technical acumen happening at an increased rate, anecdotally. And I mean, I'm seeing people pop up by the dozens on my phone. I'm like, they didn't even know how to turn on a computer a month ago, and now they're like Telegram, Signal, So to answer your question, yes, the dark web has always been a safe haven has traditionally been a safe haven for misfits, poo-poo posters, marginalized social groups in all parts of the world. And now these conversations are becoming mainstream, which on the one hand, I'm like, yes, privacy matters. It's important. But on the other hand, yes, it will increase challenges for all the things Candace talked about. How do you find people to get a subpoena for RICO? And so start, you can start naming all the issues that are gonna begin to arise. So that's a long, interesting journey down Adam's brain that connect the dots that yes, it's going to become more, as our acumen increases, so does the, ability to network out who's who, or as the Russians say, who is who. So that's what I have to say about that. Thank you. I hope that helps. I hope that answers your question. There's some really good questions.
Yeah. I want to, here's one. This is from an anonymous asker. How does left-wing extremism fit into this overall analysis? I think about sort of conspiratorial type thinking in general. Do they have a relationship with QAnon and right-wing extremism? Both groups appear to share anti-elitist, anti-government skepticism and conspiracies. Are there any similarities, and do these groups interact at all? Yeah, Candace, go for it.
Well, I mean, so there's always a possibility that you're so right that you're left and so left that you're right. I think that we are seeing that kind of the closing of the circle in a lot of different ways, but I don't think you have a ton of left-wing adherents to QAnon. That's a test. It's probably worth researching. Probably somebody could write a dissertation or two on, what that strain would look like. I'm a little skeptical of the idea that there are QAnon adherents who also profess to be on the progressive side of things, just because of the way the architecture of beliefs don't particularly appeal. And in fact, I think if we take seriously some of the research that's recently been done about the social psychology of the authoritarian mindset, it seems highly unlikely that you'll find a lot of adherence. But I do think where you do see them meeting, the convergence is actually more amongst the kind of paramilitary adherents of QAnon, who feel that it is their obligation as a digital soldier to take their fight offline to Antifa, right? And in fact, as we probably all know, one of the initiation rites of becoming a Proud Boy, as an example, right, is to jack somebody up who's a professed member of Antifa. So, I think, and that's a pretty scary phenomenon. And by the same token, I think you see plenty of Antifa hackers who have taken it upon themselves to become sort of, online vigilantes, doxing people with certain affiliations and so forth and so on. Some of that's real and some of it's scary. Some of the things take fine, but it still kind of contributes to this overall kind of clash between the two. That I think actually what we saw on January 6th is very telling. The idea that now is being promoted that somehow Antifa was behind everything that happened is more a symptom of what's going on in the brains of many QAnon followers today.
Thank you. We are at time. For the others of you who asked some really good questions, I'm sorry. We will need to cut it short here. And I'm also sorry that you can't join us for refreshments and so on in the lobby at West Hall, but hopefully we will be back to doing that again in the near rather than the shorter future. I'm sorry, near rather than the longer future. But nevertheless, it's been wonderful to have Candace, Adam, and Jamie with us today. So thank you all for sharing from your expertise. Thank you to Sarah, Tracy, and John at the CSRC for hosting the event. Thank you all for attending and for participating with your comments and questions. I hope you all will be well, stay healthy, and take care of one another. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for attending. If you want more information on our upcoming events, that's available on our website. I also wanted to just briefly read the comment from Sarah Riccardi-Schwartz, our stranded panelist, who offers a lot of insight on the religious dimension of QAnon. We posted it in the chat, but just for those of you that are watching through the live broadcast, she writes, "Certainly QAnon and evangelical Christianity share much of the same apocalyptic language. Fears about the end of days, concerns over the influence of power of governmental agencies over American Christianity, and the idea of Satan or evil forces corrupting our social reality. At the same time, QAnon does not possess a guiding moral or Slavinic language of evangelicalism, namely that one can be saved by Jesus through a personal experience with him. So while there is some overlap with evangelical rhetoric, we have seen polls that suggest that upwards of 25% of evangelicals in the US agree with the core tenets of Q. To say that QAnon is defined by evangelicalism is a bit of a misnomer. In terms of language, we could just readily say that QAnon incorporates the language, game theory, narratives, of the elders of Zion. That being said, I do know that Q has resonated with evangelicals and other Christians, whether they invoke the name of Q or if they simply spread Q's conspiracies that are embedded into far-right media and the news, which is often the case with the far-right Orthodox Christian folks that she works with. So that's her insight. Thank you for those of you who stayed on. Again, information for upcoming events is available on our website at csrc.asu.edu/events. And if you like talks like this and want to support other public lectures, consider making a donation at csrc.asu.edu/support. This talk has been recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. Thank you, Jason and Adam and Candace and Jamie, who's hopped off, and we wish you well. Bye, everyone.